Hey, it's your host Xavier here. Last episode, I promised that we'd talk about the surveying of the Manhattan street grid in New York City. That story shares a lot of historical connective tissue with Thomas Jefferson's nationwide survey grid. But, unfortunately, I realized the story I was telling didn't have room for such a lengthy digression. Anyway, if you're still interested in hearing that story, I've got good news. We'll be covering it in the first bonus episodes of Chicagoland. For just $5 a month, you can listen to all the Chicagoland bonus episodes as they come out. That's way cheaper than Disney+. I mean, they do have the Ewoks animated series, so I guess I see the value proposition. But seriously, putting together an episode of Chicagoland takes days of research, writing, and preparation even before we get to recording or editing audio. It's really important to me to be clear-eyed and honest about our history, and to actually understand the places that we inhabit. If you think that's a valuable mission, then really consider subscribing to Chicagoland on Patreon. Just a word of warning to iPhone owners: if you subscribe to Chicagoland on your iPhone, do not pay inside the Patreon app. Apple charges 30% extra for all subscriptions on the app and then pockets the fee. Just go to patreon.com/Chicago_land on the Safari app and pay there instead. Now let's get back to the show that you came here for. Yeah, so many Chicagoans will tell you that there is a normal size for a city block to be. And some of the ones who have looked into it will tell you that the correct size is 8 to a mile.
Mm-hmm.
We should see an 8x8 grid dividing up each PLSS section. But we've just established that isn't the pattern we see in the early plats. Instead, there's a patchwork hodgepodge in the different real estate developments. Yeah.
Yeah, that's how that goes.
And none of the neighborhoods even really have very consistent block size. Usually the surveyors, well, it just seems like the surveyors cram in the blocks where they'll fit in a lot of these sections. Okay. So we're going to have to wait for this map to load. It's going to take approximately 30 seconds, I think. You can see my spinning wheel of death mouse cursor. That's fine. Doesn't matter. So when did this standard block size appear, and how did it take over the city? Well, this is concerning.
All good questions.
It may crash.
It hasn't been 30 seconds. 30 seconds is longer.
We just gotta wait. I could not find any definitive information on the topic, which I found wild, honestly, because it's such a fact of the city. I looked at a bunch of maps from the 19th century that were in the Encyclopedia of Chicago website and the University of Chicago Library's digitized map collection. Based on these maps, I came up with a hypothetical explanation. Let's look at the facts.
Here's another.
It's loading. It's loading. It's loading.
We're getting our maps.
First, in 1836, there were no subdivisions divided up into eighth-mile blocks. The next earliest map that's available is 1849, and it already shows several subdivisions divided up with eighth-mile squares.
When was the fire?
71, or is it 73?
Mm-hmm,
But it does not happen yet. It's early 1870s. Editing Xavier here. The Great Chicago Fire occurred in 1871, and the Second Chicago Fire in 1874. Okay. The second fact we have is that the subdivisions that use the standard Chicago block size are spread out around the edge of the growing city. I would have expected that the earliest neighborhood to adopt the eighth-mile block would be like a sort of nucleus that other additions would grow around. That's not true.
No, that kind of makes sense to me. That like they're still sort of figuring it out in the first couple plots, and as it gets a little bigger and a little bigger, they figure out the more standardized way of doing things.
Yeah. So let me show you a few of them. We have this canal tract subdivision, which is mostly not sold off at this point. Some of the blocks are divided up into individual building lots. We have this canal tract subdivision over here in yellow. We have Sampson's Greens, or Sampson and Greens edition. I'm going to ignore the ones that aren't divided up into property lots yet, or divided up into smaller lots yet. We have this canal tract subdivision, which is almost a perfect grid, except for Lake Street cuts through at an odd angle, since it's on a ridge. We have part of Sheffield's edition over here is mostly correct. In yellow again. And then we have this pink canal tract subdivision up here on the north side.
What are all these canal tracts about?
Good question! So, the third and final fact is that most of the sections divided up using eighth mile squares were surveyed by the Canal Commission. Remember that original half-section plat surveyed by Thompson in 1830. That was the first subdivision sold off by the Canal Commission, but they continued gradually selling off land grants until the Panic of 1837. So what happened was you had sections that formed a checkerboard pattern because they were granted to the Canal Commission by the federal government. This is an early example of using land grants to fund transportation corridors, which would become the way that you built large transcontinental railroads during the later 19th century. During the economic crisis after the Panic of 1837, the state of Illinois panicked about its big debt obligations, and in 1840 they authorized the commission to survey and sell off land to pay off the accruing interest. Commissioners thought that was a terrible idea because it was the land that was the collateral for the debts. And besides, the land was going to become more valuable once the canal was built. In 1841, the state decided just to stop making interest payments instead. Which, when you're a government, is, I guess, something you can do. Reading between the lines, it seems like some of the canal land was sold off in 1840, including this pink area up here, which would become part of Lincoln Park on the north side. And this area down here in yellow, the northern part of which becomes Motor Row on the near south side. So, I'm going to put the pieces together here to explain what I think happened. Early surveyors were only responsible for platting the areas within a single section, or a half section, or quarter section, or whatever it happened to be. So they were incentivized to complete their surveys quickly and had no incentive to coordinate with each other. By contrast, the surveyors of the Canal Commission were more organized and had a regional perspective. After all, they were not just invested in Chicago, but also Lamont, Lockport, Joliet, Morris, Ottawa, LaSalle, basically all the towns along the canal and onto the Illinois River. It makes sense to me that they would develop a repeatable system to sell off the lots from the discontinuous sections. Where the canal sections touched existing neighborhoods, the surveyor might choose to continue the existing streets, like we see on the near south side. That was the Motor Row area. You can see that there are north to south streets that are 6 to a mile, that are just continuing the ones further north, but the east to west streets are 4 to a mile. Or, wait, no, sorry. The north to south streets are 12 to a mile, and the east to west streets are 8 to a mile, because this is a half section. Yeah. So it's a half square mile.
Am I crazy, or am I seeing like a 4 pattern going north south and a 6 pattern going east west?
The streets that are, if you were traveling, say, along 22nd Street heading east here, you would count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 streets to the half mile.
Yes. Okay. Cool.
Yeah. So the streets that run north-south are 12 to a mile. That's what I meant. In other sections, there was either no prevailing pattern of street grids, or there was a riotous confusion of competing patterns. Let's find one where they compete. Let's see. Like, for example, here on the east side of the river, you have whatever the heck's going on here, but on the west side, a whole bunch of different things are going on. Some of the streets continue, most don't. In these cases, the commission surveyors seem to have followed the implicit logic of the PLSS grid. If sections were divided into quarters, and quarters could be divided into quarters, what's stopping you from making a block 1/4 of a quarter subdivision? So that's how I imagine it going down. And once you have several subsections laid out into eighth-mile grids, it just makes sense for the private real estate surveyors to line their streets up with the existing ones. And the result, weirdly, of all of this non-planning is one of the world's most orderly street grids, which really flies in the face of the city's history. As a Western boomtown in the 1830s, Chicago grew so quickly there was no time at all for a city to be planned. From fewer than 100 permanent residents in 1830, Chicago exploded to 30,000 in 1850. In another 20 years, the population was 300,000. That's 1,000% growth, by the way, in 20 years.
Wow.
By 1890, it was 1 million. Chicago was exactly the kind of commercial and industrial city that Jefferson detested. But ironically, the grid system that Mansfield laid out and that Jefferson had planned gave the city its strict organizational skeleton. The PLS sections and subsections are incredibly modular. Any landowner could plug a neighborhood into one of the squares or rectangles, and it will always fit into the broader street grid context. Even if the individual streets don't, at least the major streets that run along section lines do line up.
Like I was saying.
Yeah, exactly. So the metaphor I was thinking of is like a quilt, because any square patch could go anywhere, theoretically. Let's look at a few examples. I'm going to turn this map off, and hopefully it doesn't crash anything. So right here, we're looking at a 1-mile section that became Wicker Park. Let's turn the roads on so we can see. So we're in between Chicago Avenue at the south, and is that north to the north? And then on the east, it's Ashland, and on the west, Western, which was named because Western was originally the western boundary of the city.
Yes. And it's also the longest continuous street in Chicago to this day.
Oh, that's a good fact. That's a fun fact.
It's also, it was one of my trivia questions when I guest judged.
Smart.
It was also, it's like just under 26 miles. So my proposal is to remake the Chicago Marathon in the inconvenient for all crosstown traffic configuration with just like the broadest cultural tour of the city that you can have on one straight run.
No kidding. That's fun. Yeah. And then me working downtown can just ignore all of it. I don't work downtown anymore. Let's look at this. If we divided this section into quarter sections, we can see one in the southwest that follows the grid system religiously. The one in the southeast halfway follows it, but we have some weird east to west streets. The one in the northwest is similar. It's like half correct, half weird streets. And the one in the northeast is just weird, especially with the diagonal street Milwaukee running through it.
Yeah, classic.
This is a sort of typical Chicago neighborhood section. Here's another one.
Yeah.
On the south side, we're looking at a section that's in Inglewood, one of the most systematically white-flighted communities in Chicago.
You got Garfield to the north, 63rd to the south, Ashland again, but this time to the west, and then Halstead to the right, to the east.
And basically all of these blocks seem to fit correctly. Oh, that's not right. The blocks to the north, the east to west streets aren't quite right. Oh, because of Garfield Boulevard, probably. Yeah, because the wide boulevard. So yeah, this basically follows the rules.
Nice.
So this is another typical Chicago neighborhood layout. This was one of the most prosperous neighborhoods in Chicago for the early 20th century. And let's take it to another prosperous neighborhood. This one's actually a suburb. So this is 2/3 of Riverside. The other third is half a section up here. And like you said
And we
earlier.
see that same bullshit where it's like perfectly square plot with a bunch of fucky, twisty, curvy streets in the middle to make it feel like you're living the East Coast cowpath plotted
Yeah, exactly.
suburban
Yeah.
dream.
Yeah, Riverside's an early example of a affluent suburb with wavy drives, and it's actually a railroad suburb. And you can see that
Ah,
the land they purchased for it was 1.5 sections. You can see this half section to the north, and it just slots perfectly into the mile wide section lines, just like any other neighborhood, except that
mm-hmm,
everything within it is on a different plan.
mm-hmm.
And finally, we'll take a look at something that's not a neighborhood at all, but is in fact one
Oh
exact square
wow, wait.
mile of perfectly
I also
compact
just like
airport.
yeah, Midway is just this little mile square X.
Yeah, that's correct.
But there was also just like as the thing was hopping over here, another just section of industry in the middle of
Oh, you can see this
yep,
area here, which looks like it might be like a quarter
yep, kind of
section.
along yeah, but also just
Oh
along the
yeah.
river to the north.
Oh yeah. Oh, you can see the lines plonk, clonk, clonk, clonk. Yeah, that would have been a half section as
Yep.
well, probably. So once you start seeing that pattern, you start seeing it everywhere, and it's usually
Yeah.
not as perfect as this, but for sure.
That is
So
wild.
I keep talking about this 1/8 mile square block as the standard block size in Chicago, but I'm actually lying. The actual standard block is half that size because there's a street down the middle.
Mm-hmm.
So if we looked at most Chicago blocks, they're actually narrower. I don't know if this is typical 1/8 mile long. Let me see if I can find a really good one. Let's go back to where I knew it was working. So if we looked at like, yeah, one of these blocks. Here we go, typical block. It's actually not a 1/8 mile by an 1/8 mile, but an 1/8 mile by a 16th mile. Now we're getting into really clunky subunits of miles. So let's start using feet instead.
Well, we were talking about the eights and the blocks, quote
Yeah.
unquote. Like it's really the hundreds and the
Yes,
addresses.
exactly. But that was not the case at that point in Chicago history.
Oh,
It doesn't
okay.
happen until the turn of the century to like the early 1900s or the
Mm-hmm.
early 1900s. Okay, back to some measuring hell. I apologize. So I'm gonna call
Mm-hmm.
these sub blocks. So let's say we had like this block between Augusta and Iowa, and then this block between Oakley, and leave it as you were saying, Soma. That would be worth 100 addresses. But
Mm-hmm.
this street Walton bisects it and creates two smaller sub blocks. Sometimes they're east to west, sometimes north to south. So theoretically,
Mm-hmm.
our sub block is 660 feet long and 330 feet wide. So let's test that by measuring. I've got this measuring tool. It measures in feet. I'm going to measure from the corner of this block to the corner of the next block.
660 feet. Yo, there it is.
Okay. And I'm going to measure the other direction, 330.
Oh, we're clocking it at 3. You're a little bit diagonal. You're a little bit diagonal. Let's get it right. I
Whatever.
think
We know
340.
that it's 330.
335. Yeah, there we go. Fudged it well enough.
Mm-hmm. 660, is that a familiar number?
Yes. The chains are 66 feet, right?
Yep.
That's 10 chains long.
10 chains, which is also known as a furlong.
A fur So that's what a furlong is. Cool.
So the block here would be 1 furlong by 1/2 furlong, or 660 feet by 330 feet.
I'm gonna measure my walking around Chicago in
You should
furlongs
you
from
should
now
use
on.
furlongs. That would be the most convenient way to communicate with people. And we'll also explain acres. An acre is 1 chain by 1 furlong traditionally. Yeah, so an acre is a measure of area, so it could be any shape. But traditionally, it's 660 feet by
But
66
it's
feet.
66 by 6.
And the thinking behind this is that,
Wow.
well, it goes back to medieval agriculture in Britain. The idea is that a plot that's
Mhm.
66 feet long, sorry, a plot that's 660 feet long could be plowed by a single farmer in a day with a team of oxen. But our Chicago blocks are also longer than they are wide, so they're similar. If you put 5 acres side by side, you would get a 660 by 330 foot block. And that also means that the square eighth mile by eighth
Mhm,
mile block
mhm.
is 10 acres. You might be curious how the streets themselves fit into how we measure blocks. The answer is yes. They certainly do somehow. I've seen some sources include streets in the block measurements and some leave them out. In Chicago, the 660 by 330 number does include the streets, because the neighborhoods are aligned with the PLSS grid. So everything has to be taken out of that space. So typical streets are 66
Mhm.
feet wide. As we mentioned earlier, that's one chain. So you're really taking 33 feet out of the block on either side. So 660 by 330, if you knock a 33 feet off of each one of the 4 sides, you really end up with something closer to 590 feet by 260 feet.
It just comes out in the wash.
Yeah, right. Major streets can be wider. For example, Western Avenue, mentioned earlier, is 100 feet wide.
Do the do the plots include the alleys in the back?
Yeah, I didn't even mention the alleys. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. Not even talking about the alleys here. But
sure.
yeah, the sidewalks are included in the 66-foot wide right of way, though, which makes sense. I mean, 66 feet is really wide if it was just like a little narrow
Just street, yeah.
neighborhood street. Let's compare that to the standard block size in Salt Lake City, Utah. Unlike Chicago, the Mormon civic leaders of Salt Lake City were able to plan ahead, and they platted out their downtown using a single consistent square block size. Let's get all the way over there. I should have had a command to do this, and I forgot to. Oh well.
Yeah, this is like the one that you really want.
Oh, because it's such a big shift.
There we
Yeah,
go.
we're getting close. We're getting close. Here's downtown.
Why is it sideways?
What?
Or
Oh, it's
are we
just a
north
Google
south
Earth
again
thing.
now?
It doesn't keep it level while you move around because the Earth is a
I
sphere.
see.
It's fine.
Why is the Earth as
Yeah,
anyway?
yeah, it's upsetting. Um, Now, several sources I've read call Salt Lake City blocks 660 feet on each side, which would be the same size as 2 Chicago subblocks put together. That's a lie. Salt Lake City's blocks are even bigger. The grid is not aligned to the PLSS. So they kept the 660 number because it's convenient to measure, but only between 2 sides of a block. So if I measure this block, we'll get something like 780.
Oh, so the actual block has 6.
Yes. If I just measure the block here, we get something like 660. Although I think I have to measure between just excluding the sidewalks.
Yeah, because the sidewalks be included in the right of way.
Yeah, exactly. So, yep, 660.
Wow. So then what so they, like, had their own survey grid that just they bought a bunch of PLSS plots and, like, said, "Fuck you" to
Yeah, actually,
the traditional
I
subdivisions.
think that's basically correct. Although now that you mentioned it, I don't actually know if PLSS had surveyed that land at that point.
Ah.
Yeah, the streets are also like 2 chains wide. They're insanely wide. Everything's like oversized, and the blocks are so big you like can't use the middles of them. So you
Is
have to like you have to
66
put like other streets in between them, or like get weird alleys to access them.
is a 66 foot distance actually called a chain?
Uh, yeah, I mean it's interconvertible.
But, like, is a chain a unit of distance, or are we just calling it that because of the
A
chain
chain
that
is a
you
measure
mentioned?
of distance, correct?
Cool.
So yeah, so including 132-foot right of ways for the streets, it's something. I think the number I got was 792 foot blocks.
It's just sort of it's anti-human at that
It's
scale.
yeah, it's cyclopean. Salt Lake City isn't the only place where the roads were measured separately from the properties that they divide. This is going to be a quick digression. Western Canada uses a national grid system similar to the PLSS, but the history is different. The provinces of Canada joined together into an independent confederation in 1867. Like the US, Canada was trying to expand its influence to the west and was actively competing with its southern neighbor to dominate the territories further from its metropole. Basically, the boundary between the US and Canada was not set at this point.
Mm-hmm.
In 1871, Canada initiated surveys of the prairie provinces. Those are Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, and I think it spilled over a bit into British Columbia as well. And this survey is basically a copy of the PLSS. It's called the Dominion Land Survey. Just like PLSS, it uses township squares that contain 36 mile-by-mile sections. But there is a subtle difference. Some of the section lines have space reserved for roads. The reserved road rights-of-way are either one chain, that's 66 feet, or 1.5 chains, that's 99 feet wide. Unlike the Salt Lake City blocks, the Dominion Land Survey roads are more of a rural phenomenon, but I thought it deserved a mention.
Mm-hmm.
We're coming into the home stretch now. So, by the turn of the century, Chicago had grown to well over 1 million people, decisively beating out Philadelphia as the country's second largest city. The population explosion was a combination of continued growth, as well as the fact that the city annexed many of its nearest suburbs. In 1889 alone, 4 townships were annexed. So those are going to be Lake, the town of Lake, Hyde Park, Jefferson, and Lakeview. You can see that that essentially quadrupled the size of the city's geographic area.
It's just called Lake.
It's town of Lake, yeah. Usually you just call it town of Lake if you want to be clear what you're talking about.
Because there's also a Lake County up to the north.
There is a Lake County. There is a Lakeview Township apparently also.
Well, there's no view of the lake in Lake.
It's confusing because Lake is the township that doesn't border the lake. I mean, there presumably are some lakes there. Navigating the massive super municipality instantly became a nightmare. Even before 1889, Chicago's street names and addresses were already a disorganized mess. Many streets changed names along their length, especially when they encountered a river, a subdivision with a different street layout, or a former municipal boundary. I think there were also at least 3 different street numbering systems. 2 of which didn't even try. Anyway, here's an excerpt from the 1891 Standard Guide to Chicago. It's like a tourism guide. I like how snarky it is. Street nomenclature in Chicago is likely to confuse the visitor. It is not clear even to old residents. There is an entire absence of system in the naming of streets. From where a system has been attempted, it has only served to increase the confusion. From Washington south, it was the evident intention to name the streets after presidents, but those which are so named are not in the proper order, and Jefferson and Lincoln streets are on the west side, while Johnson is a little back street in the southwestern part of the city. Streets named after trees, such as elm, oak, pine, etc., are on the north side, and Walnut is on the west side. There is a Lake Street and a Lake Avenue, the latter miles away from the former. There is a Park Avenue on the west side and a South Park Avenue miles away on the south side, etc. They go on for a long time. I'm skipping a lot of it. Practically, there is no distinction between streets and avenues. Both run north and south, east and west, and diagonal. Which, that's basically true of the city today, but whatever. What the standard guide doesn't mention is that the east-west running streets on the south side were numbered at this point. There was a city ordinance passed in 1861 that replaced the existing street names with numbered ones. The numbers started at 12.
Because it was 12 away from the 0 point.
No. Because it was 12 streets away from the river. There wasn't a 0 point yet. Remember, the street addresses begin renumbering every time they cross a river or cross a municipal boundary or cross, or sometimes they start at the lake.
Wait, so is this a different numbering system than we have today?
Oh, yeah, totally. Not the Southside street numbers, but the addresses system they used back then. But yeah, so in 1861, they did rename all of the east to west running streets on the south side after numbers, starting with the number 12 at the street named 12th Street, which was the only one that was numbered at that point. Just standing there on its own, because it's the 12th Street south of the river. And then so they go from there, 13, 14, 15, 16, etc. So that's why all the south side streets are numbered. The ordinance reads, there are now in the city of Chicago some 40 streets bearing duplicate names and several hundred streets with similar names differing only in an affix, such as courts, avenues, places, and streets. Much confusion and annoyance is caused by reason of this condition and the further fact that address numbers do not correspond on parallel streets. Very much the same complaint we saw in the standard guide. So the prosperous South Side got a head start on street address reform. But after the 1889 annexations, the confusion was worse than it had ever been. And this is not a trivial issue. There were actual business costs associated with shipping mail to Chicago because mistakes were just more common there than in other cities. All right. So, enter one local man. His name was Edward Brennan. He was as knowledgeable about the problem as anybody. He had previously done deliveries for his dad's grocery store, and later he was a bill collector for the Lyon and Healy Company, which apparently is one of the world's largest harp manufacturers. So I guess he was following up on payment installments for harpists. Anyway, Brennan is a typical white-collar clerk in the Loop, working at the turn of the century. And like any white-collar man, he needs a hobby. Brennan's hobby was drawing up plans to fix Chicago's confusing address system.
A kindred spirit.
A kindred spirit.
Your beloved host.
Yeah, I don't know what you're talking about. I've never planned a transportation system in my life, just for fun. In 1901, he sent a letter to the city council detailing his plan. They brushed him off, saying, in effect, well, this issue keeps coming up, but everyone gets angry every time we talk about doing something. So Brennan kept sending letters, and he kept going to city council meetings, and was a constant thorn in their side for 8 years. Eventually, the city council implemented a version of his plan in 1909. The core of the plan was to create a new coordinate system. Brennan used the underlying PLSS system, but shifted the frame of reference to put downtown Chicago as the origin point instead of Centralia, Illinois. He chose a single central starting point for addresses, and that was a major improvement. Like I mentioned, the old system, the address numbers would start at the lakeshore, or wherever the street crossed the Chicago River, or wherever the street crossed into one of the annexed former suburbs. Brennan chose the intersection of Madison and State Streets.
Because it was the original plot.
Because it was the nearest section intersection. It was the nearest section boundary. Sorry, let me rephrase that. It was the nearest intersection of PLSS sections to downtown Chicago. This is the basic plan. So the street names you see on the top are the streets that run north and south. And the streets on the east and west of this are the streets that run to the east and west. Mm-hmm. And you can see that there's a citywide grid system. It was already there, by the way. It was just the Jeffersonian public land survey system grid. But Brennan was able to recognize, well, probably a lot of people were able to recognize, but Brennan was the one who was insistent enough to make the city council do something about it. So here's where we come back to the standard Chicago city block. One block is an 1/8 mile long, so it stands to reason that traveling 1 mile along a street will carry you 8 blocks. Brennan's plan reassigned a range of 100 possible addresses to each block, so 8 blocks would span 800 possible addresses. That means that multiples of 800 represent 1 mile of distance. You see these numbers on a lot of the Chicago street signs today. For example, Ashland Avenue is 2 miles west of State Street, and it has the number 1600. That's 2 times 800. And if you go through a major intersection, you will see that sign on that intersection. Mm-hmm. So yeah, the block immediately west of Ashland is the 1600 block. The next block after that is the 1700 block, etc., etc.
Yeah, like 1600 north.
1600 north. That's
marker on all the signs or whatever on the.
Let's see. It's
X100 direction.
It turns out that north is north. 1600 north is north.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah. So on this particular diagram, we're looking at every half miles is marked with a street.
Mm-hmm.
So 400s, multiples of 400s are half miles, and multiples of 800 are full miles.
Yeah.
You can still see that this street grid is present in a lot of like the city maps, including like the transit map. When you look at the bus lines, not only are the streets named, but also the green numbers tell you what the number of the block is for those major streets that buses run down.
That's a very helpful way of getting around.
Yeah, I've never seen this on any other transit map. Presumably because there are very few cities that are like this. There are a lot of neighborhoods that have irregular block sizes, and in these cases, we have to fudge the numbers. Let's take a look at part of Thompson's original street grid plan from 1830. Let's say that you're driving west on Wacker Drive starting at State Street, here on the right.
Mm-hmm.
While you're driving, you'll see signs for 800 west, you'll see signs for 0 west at State, 36 west at Dearborn, 100 west at Clark, 140 west at LaSalle, and Wells isn't labeled in this case, but it would be 200.
Mm-hmm.
So since there's more blocks than 8 in a mile, you just need to add little intervening block numbers.
Yeah, just wherever the addresses happen to be.
So it gets a little messier. For example, Dearborn is bracketed by State and Clark, so its addresses on this block here are sort of nebulously in between 36 and 99. I just wanted to say the word nebulous.
I'm just kind of appreciating the verdigris copper roof on the Merchandise Mart.
Oh yeah, Merchandise Mart rules. Did you know that Merchandise Mart was built on top of a freight rail yard? And they just left the rail yard under there after they built Merchandise Mart on top.
Like as a ground floor of the building?
It's in the basement, yeah. I mean, this is a topic again for another day.
Like
actually, there's multiple railroads that were built. There were multiple underground railroads underneath Merchandise Mart, but it's not pertinent right now.
So it was just receiving goods in the basement from trains.
Yeah. Well, it was originally Chicago and Northwestern's main stockyard in downtown Chicago, but they moved it across the river later.
That's very clever.
Yeah. Yeah, and for shipping, it was convenient. I'll probably cut that because this is the topic for a future episode.
Yes.
Let's run the same exercise on the tiny Kinsey edition blocks. Do you remember the Kinsey edition?
Yes.
The Kinsey edition? I'm waiting for this to load. The Kinsey edition? There it is, the Kinsey edition.
The Kinsey scale.
So let's say we're driving north on State Street, starting on Kinsey Street. We'll see 400 north, 430 north, 500 north, 530 north, 600 north. Here's where it gets fun. 628 north, 658 north, 700 north, 732 north, and finally 800 north. Because remember, there have to be 9 blocks in this half mile space. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
Yeah.
There's still a little bit of funkiness that we have to address on the south side, because that 1861 reform I mentioned does not mesh neatly with the 1909 Edward Brennan reform.
Mm-hmm.
So remember, back in 1861, the city council was not thinking about measuring 8 blocks to a mile. So they simply assigned a number to each successive street. But not all of the streets were at the correct distance, an eighth of a mile apart. As a matter of fact, most of them were not. So in 1909, the city council had 3 unappealing choices. 1, renumber all south side streets to have 8 numbered streets per mile, which would have changed all the numbers on all of the south side streets. 2, Assign 800 block numbers per mile without renumbering the streets, in which case the hundreds numbers would not match the numbers on the street signs, right? It would be like
Hate that.
12th Street would have 800, and 31st Street would have 2400.
Hate that.
Hate that. And then option 3, which is that we're just going to give block numbers that match the existing street numbers up until 31st Street, when the block sizes become standard again.
And which one did they do?
The third one.
Oh. Again, I haven't really used that navigational system closer to downtown. Like, it was mostly like in Hyde Park. So.
Yeah, and then you could still say, oh, I went from 51st to 55th Street. That's half a mile easy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So they chose option 3. For the first 3 miles south of Madison Street, the miles are not multiples of 800. The first mile is marked by 12th Street, which is Roosevelt Road today. The second mile is 22nd Street, which is Cermak Road. Mm-hmm. And mile 3 is 31st Street. But once you get south of 31st Street, you can go ahead and start adding multiples of 400 and 800, and it all works again.
That's why it's 51 to 63.
Yeah, that's why the important streets are all weirdly odd numbers. 31st, 39th, 43rd, 47th, 51st, 55th, 59th, 63rd.
Mind-blowing.
Yeah, it's, again, not ideal, but it's the situation we're in. You can see that scale here.
Hey, I mean, it kind of worked out. Like, having the like the little odd street numbers be your major streets was kind of like, it's a fun quirk, you know?
It is a quirk. Maybe they're more memorable if they have odd numbers on. Like 47th just seems like a memorable number to me. I don't know. That was a lot of numbers and measurements, but I hope you see why I included it all.
Yes.
Yeah. So now we know that the Chicago street layout is a downstream consequence of the U.S. settler colonial project, clearly. I mean, it's obvious that Chicago, that all of the United States is there because it's a settler colonial project, but science and philosophy from the Enlightenment era informed Jefferson's choice to use a Newtonian coordinate grid as the framework for his ideal republic of white farmers. And then, as Jefferson's Empire of Liberty, emphasis on empire, projected into the Midwest, Chicago became centrally important to that empire. It just happened to be in the right location to funnel all the resources from the western frontier into the eastern metropole. And because the city's growth was too fast and decentralized for proper planning, Jefferson's grid became the default city plan. And that's the grid.
And that's the grid.
As they say. Well, it's been a pleasure having you on, Soma.
Wow, I'm just taking this all in.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure learning more about the downstream effects of the horrifying philosophical basis for genocide.
Yeah, I mean, it starts by learning the downstream effects and being like, well, this is great. The city is all organized and it's got numbers and this is fun. I'm having fun.
Nice
You
and
learn
rational
more
and
more.
conforms to my
You become
Western
less happy.
Enlightenment sensibilities.
Yeah, exactly. Well, where can the listeners find you?
Where can listeners find me? Don't find me.
Oh, yeah. They're going to hunt you down.
Stalkers? I don't know. Well, okay, you guess you can find me online. That seems safe.
I was hoping for that.
Yeah, I'm a Somatosensation on Instagram. You should also check out stoned_succubus_band on Insta. And all the links to our other stuff is on there, like our Bandcamp. I've got my Bandcamp link on mine. Yeah.
Beautiful. All right. Until next time.
Until next time, thank you so much.
You've been listening to Chicagoland, a production by Articulata Publishing. Chicagoland is written, edited, and produced by Xavier only. The Chicagoland theme was composed by Chris Robbin. That's Chris Robbin.